In 2023, South Korea recorded a total fertility rate of 0.2. And for reference, a country needs roughly 2.1 to maintain its existing population. South Korea's number is the lowest ever recorded by any nation in documented human history, lower than any country during any war, famine, or economic collapse in the modern era. The government has spent over $200 billion across 16 years trying to reverse it, but the rate keeps falling. The political situation inside that country looks like this. In the 2022 presidential election, 59% of South Korean men aged 18 to 29 voted for the conservative candidate, Yoon Suk-yeol, who explicitly campaigned on abolishing the Ministry of Gender Equality. In the same election, young South Korean women of the exact same age voted for the progressive opposition candidate in almost identical proportions. Nearly 70% of Korean men in their 20s say discrimination against men is a serious problem in their country. 65% of Korean women in their 20s say they do not want children. Men and women of the same generation in the same country have produced the most extreme political gender gap of any democracy on earth, and the result is a birth rate that will cut the population roughly in half by 2100 without massive immigration. The United States has been moving in the same direction for about a decade, running about 5 to 10 years behind South Korea on nearly every relevant metric. The US total fertility rate hit 1.599 in 2024, an all-time American record low. The first marriage rate has dropped 60% since 1970. Single-person households hit 38.5 million in 2024, making up for 29% of all US households, up from 19% in 1974. 63% of American men under 30 are currently single. The median age for first-time homebuyers reached 36, the oldest on record. In the 2024 election, the gender gap among voters aged 18 to 29 hit 26 points, also the largest ever recorded for that age group in American polling history. Among young Americans, 20% say political violence is sometimes justified. Among millennials, that number is 14%. Among Gen X, 8%. And baby boomers, only 3%. But only 3% of young Americans describe the United States as a healthy democracy. Only 9% believe the country is headed in the right direction. 62% of Americans under 30 hold favorable views of socialism. The Harvard Institute of Politics found that Congress earns the trust of 12% of young people, and the media earns trust from just 10%. With Wall Street, that's down to 9%, and billionaires, 6%. A generation that built political identities on distrusting every institution has also, by every available measure, become the most politically extreme cohort in the country's modern history, and the men and women within it have built those extremes in opposite directions. This is the story of how that happened, what's driving it, and what it's likely to produce over the next few decades. The common assumption is that Gen Z radicalized as a unit, that the whole generation moved left or the whole generation became more extreme right, in some kind of shared cultural shift, but the actual data tells a more specific story. Young women drove the leftward movement, and they drove it hard. Young men mostly stayed where men have historically been, and in some respects, pulled modestly toward the right in recent election cycles. Gallup has tracked political self-identification in the 18 to 29 age group continuously since 1999. In 2000, roughly 29% of young women called themselves liberal. Roughly 27% of young men said the same, a 2-point gap. Statistically insignificant. Both lines moved slowly together over the following decades. As recently as 2012, the gap was about 5 points. Then it started widening. By 2017, it had crossed 10 points. By 2021, 44% of young women identified as liberal versus 25% of young men, a 19-point gap. By 2024, young women had settled at 40% liberal while young men sat at 25%. Gallup summarized what happened to men in their own published analysis. Their ideology has been remarkably steady over the last 25 years. Every inch of that gap came from women moving left. The Financial Times mapped the same pattern across 20 wealthy democracies in early 2024 and found it replicated in every single one. In the 2025 German federal election, 35% of women voted for Die Linke, the far-left party, while 27% of young men voted for the AfD, the far-right party that came in first among young men overall. In the United Kingdom, recent polling shows young men splitting toward the right populist Reform UK, while young women move toward the Green Party. Among UK voters aged 16 to 20, 47% of men plan to vote Conservative or Reform, versus 25% of women. The Economist put a number on the global picture. Across those 20 wealthy nations, young women are currently 27 percentage points more likely than young men their own age to call themselves liberal, 5 times the gap that existed in just 2000. Two things happened simultaneously around 2012 that broke the parallel tracks apart. The first was the mass adoption of the smartphone, and the second was a sequence of high-voltage cultural events. Trump's 2016 campaign, the hashtag MeToo movement, the Dobbs decision, and the George Floyd protest, that social media platforms then amped into permanent generational identity markers for the people who encountered them between the ages of 12 and 22 before their worldviews had stabilized. Up through the early 2010s, American teenagers spent substantial chunks of time in unstructured in-person environments. After-school hangouts, part-time jobs, religious organizations, neighborhood dynamics, low-stakes situations that required navigating disagreement and building the tolerance for friction that turns into emotional resilience in adulthood. But Gen Z was the first cohort to have most of that displaced by a screen. Only 40% of Gen Z adults report spending substantial time with friends in person during their teenage years. 61% describe feeling lonely or isolated as teens, compared to 36% of baby boomers who say the same. 41% of Gen Z had no romantic partner at all during their teenage years, a figure that rises to 44% for Gen Z men specifically, more than double the 20% rate for baby boomer men at the same age. 27% of Gen Z teenagers attended therapy compared to 4% of boomers. A generation that needed more practice navigating normal human friction got significantly less of it than any cohort before them. And the platforms that filled that gap were not designed to help people figure out how to disagree with each other. They were built to maximize time on site, and the most reliable way to do that is emotional arousal, like outrage, fear, and tribal solidarity. And they sorted men and women into almost completely separate information environments. TikTok became the primary mechanism for the leftward radicalization of young women. About 60% of TikTok's user base is Gen Z, and among American users aged 18 to 29, approximately 62% are women. The platform's For You page algorithm responds to engagement so efficiently that a young woman who watches a few feminist commentary videos will find her entire feed shifting within hours. More content about systemic patriarchy, more content about gender wage gaps, more content framing male behavior as inherently suspect. A 2025 study from NYU Abu Dhabi that analyzed more than 340,000 videos over 27 weeks found systematic partisan asymmetries in what TikTok serves to users. Asymmetries that couldn't be examined, asymmetries that couldn't be explained by what users clicked on alone, suggesting the platform was actively shaping ideological exposure, not simply reflecting it. Gen Z averages roughly 9 hours per day on screens and about 3 hours specifically on social media. During COVID lockdowns, teen screen time doubled from 3.8 to 7.7 hours daily, not counting virtual school. A generation already spending more time online than any prior cohort was then locked inside with nowhere to go for a full year and a half, consuming algorithmically sorted political content at the most formative period of identity development. The hashtag MeToo movement, which broke in October 2017 following New York Times and New Yorker reporting on Harvey Weinstein, landed on the exact environment like a match on gasoline. Within weeks, it had spread from Hollywood to Silicon Valley to academia to Capitol Hill. For young women already spending hours a day on platforms engineered to amplify outrage, it became a generational organizing movement, not just on the specific issue of workplace harassment, but on how they understood men, institutions, and power broadly. The Gallup data shows the gender ideology gap crossing 10 points for the first time in 2017, precisely when hashtag MeToo was at its peak, and continuing to widen for 4 consecutive years afterward. By 2021, 61% of Gen Z women describe themselves as feminist, higher than among millennial women, Gen X women, or baby boomer women before them. On specific policy positions, the shift was even more pronounced than the general ideological shift. Between 2017 and 2024, Gallup found the share of young women saying humans cause global warming rose 20 percentage points. Support for stricter gun laws rose 16 points. Worry about race relations rose 24 points. By 2024, 86% of young women said humans cause global global warming, and 74% supported stricter gun laws. And the economic worldview shifted alongside the political one. According to a 2025 Cato YouGov poll, 62% of Americans under 30 hold favorable views of socialism. An Axios survey of college students from November 2025 found only 17% viewed capitalism positively, while 34% viewed socialism positively. In 2010, 68% of 18 to 29-year-olds viewed capitalism favorably, 21 points higher than a decade later. 48% of Gen Z respondents agree that rewards in society should be distributed based on need rather than on what people produce, which is, essentially verbatim, core Marxist doctrine. The universities these young women were passing through during this period weren't moderating these views, they were reinforcing them. In 2018, researcher Mitchell Langbert analyzed 8,688 tenure-track professors at 51 elite liberal arts colleges and found an overall Democrat to Republican ratio of 10.4 to 1. 39% of the colleges sampled had 0 registered Republican professors at all. In sociology, the ratio was 27 to 1. In anthropology, it was 42 to 1. By 2025, the Harvard Crimson Faculty Survey found exactly 5 individual professors registered Republican across Harvard's entire faculty. Among student-facing administrators, a separate analysis found a 12 to 1 liberal to conservative ratio, with only 6% of administrators identifying as conservative. The Heritage Foundation counted nearly 3,000 DEI personnel across 65 large public universities, averaging 45 per campus. At UC Berkeley, DEI statements were used as a first-round elimination screen in faculty hiring. 679 of 893 applications, or 76%, were cut based on DEI scores before their research or teaching was even reviewed. The campus incidents that accumulated during this period were frequently remarkable in their specifics. At Yale University in 2015, a lecturer named Erica Christakis sent an email questioning whether the university needed to police students' Halloween costume choices. Her husband, Nicholas Christakis, a tenured professor and medical doctor, was surrounded in the Stillman College courtyard by roughly 150 screaming students for more than 2 hours. A video of the confrontation circulated widely online, showing one young student yelling into his face. "It's not about creating an intellectual space, it's about creating a home here." Yale later gave 2 of the protest organizers the Nakanishi Prize for exemplary leadership in enriching race and ethnic relations on campus. At Evergreen State College in Washington State in 2017, biology professor Brett Weinstein, a self-described progressive who had supported the campus's day absence for years, objected when the event was redesigned to ask white people to leave campus for the day rather than having minority students voluntarily depart. Roughly 50 students disrupted his class, demanded his resignation, and called him racist. Campus police told him they couldn't guarantee his safety on his own campus. The college shut down for 3 days. Weinstein and his wife eventually settled with the institution for $500,000 and both resigned. At Oberlin College in Ohio, 3 students were arrested in 2016 for shoplifting at Gibson's Bakery, a century-old family business. All 3 later pleaded guilty, and the bakery's conduct was confirmed as not racially motivated. Regardless, hundreds of students and faculty protested outside the business for months, calling it racist. Oberlin's own dean of students personally distributed accusatory flyers. A jury ultimately awarded Gibson's $11 million in compensatory damages and $33.2 million in punitive damages. Oberlin eventually paid out $36.59 million in total, and the owner, David Gibson, and his father, Alan Gibson, aged 93, both died before receiving full payment. And making sure you're taking care of your full payment is always a priority, which is why tens of thousands of people are using Dollarwise to genuinely change their finances. It is the best budgeting app on the market, with automated account connections, real spending insights, and a 3-day free trial so you can see if it works before you commit to anything. Make sure you download the Dollarwise budgeting app, link in the description below, or dollarwise.com. Now getting back to the story, the 2024 Columbia University campus protest moved into a different category. On April 17th, students established the Gaza Solidarity Encampment on the main quad. The university called the NYPD, resulting in 108 arrests on a single day. Protesters then occupied Hamilton Hall, which they later renamed Hines Hall. By the time police cleared it, 300 people had been arrested at Columbia and City College combined. The movement spread to nearly 140 campuses in 45 states. At several of those campuses, organizers described zines that glorified Yahya Sinwar, the chief architect of the October 7th Hamas attack. Samadoun, an organization that multiple Western governments have linked to the PFLP, a designated foreign terrorist organization, held campus events with student group support. The congressional hearings that followed saw Harvard President Claudine Gay and Penn President Liz Miguel both subsequently resign. FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, published 2026 survey data showing that 66% of college students now consider shouting down a campus speaker acceptable, and 23% endorse physical violence to prevent someone from speaking. And running alongside the political radicalization is a cultural shift in how Gen Z, and disproportionately Gen Z women, use psychological language. Words like gaslighting, narcissist, toxic, trauma, boundaries, and triggered have migrated from clinical contexts into everyday social vocabulary, but stripped of their clinical precision. Gaslighting clinically refers to a sustained, deliberate campaign of psychological abuse intended to make a victim doubt their own perception of reality. On TikTok, it's applied to anyone who remembers an event differently. Boundaries, originally a tool for protecting yourself from genuine abuse, now frequently functions as a justification for aggressive social avoidance and for demanding that other people modify their behavior to accommodate your preferences. A viral exchange from social media illustrated where this logic ends up. A young woman texted a friend asking to meet up, and then mentioned she was struggling because her grandmother had just died. The friend's response read like a corporate HR document. She accused the grieving woman of guilt-tripping and trauma dumping without consent, and stated she would not tolerate such toxic behavior. Researchers who study this pattern note that using clinical language to describe normal human friction shuts down communication, bypasses personal accountability, and accelerates the exact loneliness epidemic that Gen Z reports experiencing at historically high rates. 47% of Gen Z reports frequent anxiety, 22% report frequent depression, 61% felt lonely or isolated as teenagers. The ideological rigidity that shows up in political discourse and in social behavior also shows up in how Gen Z polices romantic relationships, and specifically in the age gap panic. In a generation where 31% express support for non-monogamy and 75.8% say living together before marriage is essential, there are simultaneously large online communities devoted to identifying and harassing couples where one partner is more than a few years older than the other. The targets are not underage relationships. TikTok communities pursued a harassment campaign against a 22-year-old college senior dating an 18-year-old freshman. Jojo Siwa, aged 21, faced widespread condemnation for dating a 27-year-old. The commentary used terminology and framing typically reserved for actual grooming of minors. Cultural critics described the broader phenomenon as McCarthyism for pedophiles, the systematic application of child protection rhetoric to legal romantic choices of adults. 32% of Gen Z respondents say they actively disapprove of age gap relationships in a broad sense. Sociologists trace this partially to the extraordinary age segregation of Gen Z's upbringing. A generation raised almost entirely among exact age peers with virtually no organic intergenerational friendships has limited frame of reference for understanding older people as social equals rather than authority figures. After Trump's re-election in November of 2024, the 4B movement, originating in South Korean feminist circles and named for the 4 Korean words meaning no marriage, no birth, no dating, and no sex with men, went viral among American women on social media within hours of the election results being called. A single tweet recommending that American women adopt the 4B framework accumulated nearly 17 million views and 64,000 reposts in 24 hours. Google searches for 4B movement spiked 450% on election night. The movement originated in South Korea following the 2016 murder of a young woman at a Seoul subway station, a country whose gender wage gap of 31% is the worst in the OECD, where the government has spent over $200 billion trying to reverse a birth rate that has kept falling regardless, and where 65% of women in their 20s now say they don't want children and 42% say they don't want marriage. And none of the radicalization happening on the female side occurred without producing a reaction among young men, though the nature of that reaction is different from what you might expect if you're following cable news coverage of the subject. It wasn't a sudden ideological sprint to the right. It was more gradual, a withdrawal from institutions and cultural spaces that had spent years framing traditional masculinity as a problem to be solved, followed by migration toward online environments that offered a different framework for what being a man is supposed to look like. Research from King's College London found that more than a quarter of British men aged 16 to 29 believe it is harder to be a man than a woman in today's society, a view that their female peers mostly do not share. In the United States, nearly half of all men aged 18 to 29 say they feel personally discriminated against, the highest rate of any male age bracket surveyed. The 2025 NBC News survey found that 37% of young men describe themselves as extremely proud to be American, roughly double the 18.5% of young women who say the same. 22% of young women say they are not at all proud to be American. The ecosystem young men withdrew into is called the manosphere, a sprawling, decentralized network of content channels, podcasts, forums, and servers that is united by the premise that mainstream culture has demonized men while offering them nothing constructive. It spans a wide range. At one end, self-improvement content focused on fitness, financial independence, and dating strategy. In the middle, there's red pill communities arguing that feminism has corrupted the romantic marketplace and that men need to understand the real rules. Then you get into MeToo, men going their own way, a separatist movement whose members advocate total withdrawal from relationships with women as a matter of self-preservation. And at the far end, incel communities built around the conviction that physical appearance hierarchies and female hypergamy have permanently excluded certain men from any possibility of a romantic connection, and that the correct response to this is rage. The Movember Institute found that nearly 2/3 of men aged 16 to 25 regularly consume content from masculinity influencers online. In the UK, 73% of Gen Z social media users have viewed misogynist content. The pipeline from self-improvement content to radicalization is well documented. Research from Ribeiro et al. Traced user migration patterns from pickup artist communities to the red pill to the MeToo, with each stage more extreme than the last. Andrew Tate is the most visible individual figure in this ecosystem. A British-American kickboxer and social media personality, he accumulated 740,000 YouTube subscribers and 4.6 million Instagram followers before his removal from major platforms in August 2022. After the ban, individual users kept uploading his content to TikTok, where videos with his name accumulated more than 13 billion views. In the UK, 84% of boys aged 13 to 15 have heard of him. 23% hold a positive opinion of him. Among young men aged 18 to 29, 1 in 3 view him favorably, and 31% describe him as a role model. 76% of UK secondary school teachers report being extremely concerned about online misogyny affecting their male students. Teachers have documented boys telling female classmates, "I wouldn't even r*** you." A primary school teacher reported a boy saying it's okay to hurt women because Andrew Tate says so. Joe Rogan operates at the mainstream end of the male media ecosystem, reaching roughly 14.5 million listeners per episode with an audience that is 80% male and averages 24 years old. His interview with Trump alone accumulated more than 50 million YouTube views. Ben Shapiro reaches 18% of young Trump voters monthly. The top right-leaning podcasters as a group, Rogan, the Nelk Boys, Sean Ryan, Theo Von, skew 89% male on average. On the left, Hassan Piker has 2.6 million Twitch followers. The information divide among young men and young women isn't just ideological, it's infrastructural. Different platforms, different perspectives, different content genres, producing different pictures of what the world is and what your place in it should be. The incel movement crossed from an online ideology into physical violence before most people had even heard the word. On May 23, 2014, 22-year-old Elliot Rodger killed 6 people and injured 14 near UC Santa Barbara, California, having posted a manifesto explicitly grounding the attack in incel ideology. On April 23, 2018, Alec Manassian drove a rental van into a crowded Toronto sidewalk, killing 10 and injuring 16. He posted a Facebook immediately before the attack. The incel rebellion has already begun. Canadian intelligence services have since formally classified violent misogyny as a form of ideological extremism. The male reaction to a culture perceived as hostile expressed itself through the workplace as well. 74% of managers identify Gen Z as the most difficult generation to manage, an issue driven less by competence than a wholesale rejection of traditional professional norms. More than 75% of Gen Z employees have engaged in quiet quitting, deliberately performing exactly the minimum defined in a job description, nothing more. 69% say they have no interest in pursuing management. They've developed a name for the latter: conscious unbossing. Managers report needing to handle standard direct feedback with unusual care because it frequently results in emotional shutdowns or accusations of creating a toxic workplace. One Gen Z employee went viral for posting a video explaining why she refused to cancel pre-approved vacation leave during a sudden company emergency, framing it as a principled act of boundary setting. The video ran to millions of views and sparked a broad debate about what exactly has changed and how this generation understands professional obligations. The education enrollment gap is one of the most consequential structural shifts within this story, and it operates largely below public awareness. Men outnumbered women in American higher education for the last time in 1978. By 2021, 70% of female high school graduates enrolled in college versus only 55% of males, the widest gap ever recorded. There are currently 2.4 million more female undergraduates than male undergraduates in the United States. The 4-year graduation rate is 54% for women and 43% for men. Richard Reeves of the Brookings Institute identified the core structural outcome. We have wider gender inequality today in U.S. higher education than we did when Title IX was passed. It's just in the reverse direction. Because years spent in higher education correlate strongly with liberal political views, and because women now spend dramatically more time in higher education than men do, the education gap mechanically generates a portion of the ideology gap regardless of any other factor. But the biggest factor in how your money grows is where it's placed. And one of the best places to put it is in a high-yield savings account with Chime, where you get a $350 bonus for signing up. It is a nation-leading high-yield savings account with real returns on your money. And again, if you sign up with my link, chime.com/Caleb, you get a $350 bonus when you sign up. Link in the description below. And that's the economic context of your life, but the economic context underneath all of this isn't a backdrop of the story. It's honestly driving the entire gender divide. Because the median home price to income ratio in the United States was 2 in 1960. 2 years of household income bought the median home. By 2022, the Harvard Joint Center for Housing Studies recorded that ratio at 5.6, the highest in the dataset's history. A 2024 calculation showed households needing to earn $106,731 to comfortably afford the median-priced home against a median household income of $83,730. The median age of a first-time home buyer reached 36, the oldest since tracking began in 1981. Federal student debt has tripled since 2007 to $1.67 trillion. Gen Z borrowers carry an average of $22,948 in student debt, 14% higher than millennials at the same age, adjusted for inflation, and only 22% feel confident about ever paying it off. College tuition inflated at roughly 5 times the general rate since 1980. Real wages rose only 11.9% between 2006 and 2025, against normal wage growth of 78.7%. Economic pressure radicalized men and women in opposite directions for reasons researchers have now traced fairly precisely. Women are more concentrated in the public sector and care economy, more dependent on state support structures, and more supportive of redistribution to begin with. So economic anxiety pushed them toward demanding more government, which is the left-wing position. Men experienced economic anxiety as a status threat and a collapse of traditional provider identity, and right-wing populism explicitly offers the restoration of those hierarchies as its core promise. The same financial pressure filtered through different gender role expectations produced the opposite political destinations. Researchers found this mechanism operating in parallel studies of South Korea, Brazil, and the United States. In each case, male-specific economic shocks increased support for authoritarian right-wing candidates, while female-specific shocks had the reverse effect. Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff identified in their 2018 book, The Coddling of the American Mind, what they called 3 great untruths, ideas that contradict both ancient wisdom and modern psychology and produce real harm in people who internalize them. The first, that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, contradicting the established research showing children are antifragile and require exposure to stressors to rebuild resilience. The second, that you should always trust your feelings as guides to reality. The third, that life is a battle between good and evil people. All 3 were baked into the environment Gen Z grew up inside. The first through overprotective helicopter parenting that systematically cleared obstacles, the second through the therapy speak culture of social media, and the third through identity politics framing a progressive activism on campus and online. The generation that absorbed all 3 simultaneously arrived at adulthood with a particular vulnerability to ideological capture. The dating and relationship data shows where all of this lands in practice. Pew Research found that 63% of American men under 30 are currently single versus 34% of women in the same bracket, though the General Social survey puts the male to female single gap closer to 10 points, when accounting for men who date younger women outside the 18 to 29 survey frame. On dating apps, female users swipe 14% of the time on average. Male users swipe right 46% of the time. OkCupid found 72% of female respondents saying they couldn't date someone with opposing political views. Political mentions in dating profiles increased 187% between 2017 and 2018 alone. In Washington, D.C., OkCupid data shows the share of users requiring same-party matches jumped from 45% in summer of 2024 to 58% after Trump's January 2025 inauguration. The 2025 NBC News survey data makes the divergence concrete at the level of personal values. Gen Z men who voted for Trump ranked having children first on the list of what defines personal success. Gen Z women who voted for Harris ranked children second to last. Young female Harris voters ranked emotional stability third most important. Young male Trump voters ranked it second to last. Marriage ranked 4th among Trump young voting men and 11th among Harris voting young women. These are not different positions on immigration or tax policy. They reflect fundamentally different versions of what a life well lived is supposed to look like, and they are held by people who would, in prior generations, have expected to build that life together. Prior waves of young radicalism have typically softened over time, and there is empirical support for that. Baby boomers who protested Vietnam became Reagan voters a decade later. Gen X channeled its discontent into cultural production, punk, grunge, ironic detachment, rather than sustained organized politics. Millennials gave the world Occupy Wall Street in 2011, which dissolved without producing any lasting political organization. Longitudinal research by Peterson, Smith, and Hibbing in the Journal of Politics found that political attitudes are remarkably stable over the long term. British data puts the annual probability increase of voting conservative at 0.38% per year of aging, compounding to roughly 19 percentage points across a lifetime. The complication for Gen Z is that home ownership has historically been the single strongest predictor of conservative drift, and Gen Z's home ownership trajectory is worse than any prior cohort in modern American history. If the economic conditions that make traditional adult milestones inaccessible persist, the standard mechanisms that moderate prior generations of young radicals may not engage. The generation's extremism didn't emerge from a temporary youthful phase. It emerged from conditions, structural housing unaffordability, debt loads that extend into middle age, an economy where real wages grew only 11.9% over 2 decades that aren't resolving on their own as people get older. Gen Z's radicalism also differs from prior youth radicalism in 3 specific ways that make it harder to dismiss as cyclical. The gap is gendered rather than generational. The 1960s divide was between young and old. Don't trust anyone over 30. Gen Z's divide runs between young men and young women within the same birth cohort. Locality's longitudinal research confirmed this directly. Young women have become significantly more liberal and embraced anti-patriarchal values over the last decade, while young men have stayed relatively the same. Second, Gen Z is polarized in both directions simultaneously. Jean Twenge found twice as many Gen Z members identifying as very conservative as Gen X members did at the same age in the Reagan era, 1980s, while the share of identifying as very liberal also increased. The political center is hollowing out inside a single generation. And third, the changes Gen Z want aren't incremental. 3 of 4 Gen Z members believe the US government's fundamental design and structure requires significant overhaul. 4 in 10 describe the founding fathers as better described as villains than heroes. The demographic projections don't require speculation about politics or culture to be alarming. The US total fertility rate of 1.599 in 2024 is already well below the 2.1 replacement threshold. The Congressional Budget Office projects it descending further to 1.53 by 2036. By 2007 and 2024, there were 11.8 million fewer births in the United States than would have occurred if pre-recession fertility rates had held. By 2030, the number of deaths in the United States is projected to exceed the number of births, which shifts the entire burden of population maintenance onto immigration, and feeds directly into the anti-immigration sentiment that is currently accelerating the rightward political shift among young men. The two dynamics are compounding each other. The fertility decline is the sharpest among the most educated women. Women aged 30 to 34 with a bachelor's degree now plan to only have 1.5 children, down from 2.1 in 2002. Among the youngest liberal women born after 2000, desired family size has dropped below replacement for the first time, to 1.8 children. The Institute for Family Studies found that a conservative woman born between 1975 and 1979 completed fertility at 2.1 children, exactly at replacement. Liberal women of the same cohort finished at 1.5. Among the youngest liberal women, projected fertility is lower still. A Morgan Stanley analysis projects that by 2030, 45% of women aged 25 to 44 will be childless and single. The 2021 American Perspective Survey found 15% of men had no close friends, up from 3% in 1990. GWI research from December 2025 found that approximately 80% of Gen Z had experienced significant loneliness in the past year. On the political side, the 30-point ideological gap between young men and young women isn't projected to close as this generation ages, particularly given that the moderating mechanisms that historically softened youth, radicalism, home ownership, marriage, parenthood, are precisely the milestones Gen Z is least likely to achieve. By 2028, millennials and Gen Z will constitute a majority of the US electorate. Policy built on that electorate will swing between radical progressive demands from the female-dominant left and populist nationalist demands from the male-dominant right, because the two halves of the generation that is inheriting governance can't find common ground in their personal lives. The institutional trust numbers underpin how severe the governance challenge is. Only 3% of young Americans describe the US as a healthy democracy. Only 9% think it's headed in the right direction. Congress earns trust from 12% of them, the media 10%. Wall Street 9%, and billionaires 6%. An electorate with those numbers don't produce centrist governance. It produces exactly what it's currently producing: escalating instability, growing executive power, declining legislative function, and a political culture where the purpose of winning isn't to govern, but to defeat the other side. South Korea remains the most useful single reference point precisely because it arrived at this destination earlier. The government spent more than $200 billion trying to reverse the birth rate, and the rate keeps falling. The gender political gap has not narrowed. Young men and young women are not reconciling. The loneliness data is not improving. South Korea isn't a warning that things might go badly. It is a demonstration of what the endpoint looks like when the forces driving Gen Z radicalization are allowed to run to completion without a structural correction. A total fertility rate of 0.72, producing, without immigration, a population roughly half its current size within 2 generations. Young people who view each other primarily as political adversaries rather than potential partners. And a government that has spent tens of billions of dollars discovering that money doesn't fix a problem rooted in cultural fracture. None of the forces that built Gen Z's fracture has reversed course. The platforms are still sorting men and women into separate realities and still optimizing for outrage because outrage is what drives engagement. The housing market remains structurally unaffordable for most of the generation. University faculties remain as politically homogeneous as they were when the radicalization accelerated. The fertility rate is still falling. The marriage rate is still descending. and the loneliness data is moving in the wrong direction. Gen Z became so radical because it was the first generation to grow up entirely inside the architecture that makes radicalization the predictable outcome. Algorithmically sorted information environments designed to maximize emotional arousal, economic conditions that made the adult milestones of prior generations structurally inaccessible, educational institutions that treated ideological conformity as a virtue, and a parenting culture that shielded children from the friction that builds the resilience required to function among people who disagree with you. The generation isn't uniquely foolish or weak. Every system they passed through was optimized to produce the people they became. And the generation behind them, Generation Alpha, now entering adolescence with smartphones, social media, and the same economic conditions, is passing through most of the same architecture. Whether enough of it gets dismantled before they arrive at adulthood is the question that will determine what Gen Z represents is the peak of the fracture or just the beginning. See you in the next one. I'll be candid. Front Page loses money. The cost of research, audio editing, video editing, and everything else that goes into this project is substantial. I believe the neutral and factual perspective we bring to these topics are important in today's culture of endless misinformation for political or financial gain. If you support the journalism we do here, please consider clicking the join button or the channel membership link in the description or pinned comment below and join in with everyone else supporting this project. Every single supporter makes a difference and helps us continue Front Page. Click join or the link in the description or pinned comment below. Thank you.